Canon versus story as an art form. Oral narrative by nature is going to be an art form because, like that quote I shared earlier, a story is going to change with each telling. And therefore, it is the art and the ability of the storyteller to bring certain details out or leave certain details behind. But we have such a problem with this in today's age because we love this idea of canon. We love this idea of having the definitive version of a thing. And it is the only version and it is the true version, which is just interesting to me because I think a lot about films and books and music. And we live in a time where we have this ownership of them. When we experience a story, we take it as our own, especially when it's a story that we love. I remember when one of my film professors was talking about how when they were growing up, you didn't buy movies. The only time you were able to go experience a movie was at the theater. And it was like a piece of music being played live. Like, you can't interrupt it, you can't pause it. Like, the story would happen in the allotted time frame, and that was it. And you either were there to experience it or you weren't. It wasn't something that you reached out and took possession of. But we live in this weird time now where, because of technology and many of the advancements that we've seen over the past probably 40 years, it has become this thing that we take ownership of stories. And of course, books have been this way for many, many years, but before books were oral narrative. And you didn't have ownership of it. You listened to a story, and then you could pass it on, but it was going to be filtered through your own lens. But books, they put a definition of the story down on hard paper, and it was unmoving and unchanging, and so people started to collect stories that way. Movies are interesting for me because it was only with the advent of the VHS tape that movies became something that we could literally possess and have be our own. And while there is so much good that comes from that, there also comes this concept of, no, this is canon, this is the final version, and this is the way it has to be. Now, there is no other example more prevalent in my mind when it comes to the audience taking ownership of the story, taking it and saying this is ours, than things we've seen in recent years with the movie Star Wars. As George Lucas has gone back and done some revisions, the fans of Star Wars have just totally hated everything that he was doing to these stories that they loved and they had ownership of. And you can delve deep into this concept of what happened with Star Wars. Just get online and start looking up the changes and how people feel about them. And there's this whole movement. You can now get online and download what they're calling, as close as they can get to the actual theatrical version of Star Wars 4, 5, and 6, the original trilogy, because people want to hark back to that canon. And so this debate has been going on in my mind because I can see the one side that when we experience a story one way and love it, we don't want to see it changed and we don't want to see it happen a different way. We want the same story every time. This again shows up with J.K. Rowling. She's been a little bit notorious on Twitter recently, sharing things and details and new information about Harry Potter that is just straight up not in the books. But she feels like as the author, she owns the narrative and therefore she is the dispenser of all Harry Potter truth. So when it comes to music, films, books, photography, there's this concept that once an author or a creator or an artist puts that out to the world, that it no longer belongs to them. That it is now the ownership of the audience to take in and interpret and enjoy or hate in any way that they want. And I think a lot of authors or creators, especially of these mega successful stories like Star Wars and Harry Potter, the creators are like, no, this is mine. This came from my heart. This is what I say it is. And there's this interesting tug of war between the audience and the creator, which to me is intriguing. And honestly, I don't have a lot of answers about whether or not this is good or bad. I just know that it is, and it's been something that's been on my mind. But it came up in my mind a lot as I have been thinking about this concept of oral narrative and this idea that when stories are shared orally, they change with time. And it's certainly something to be grappled with and something to think deep about of when we hate a different version of a story. Why? Why is it that both can't exist in the same world? That's not to say that I have any of the answers, because like many people, I was annoyed at some of the changes that George Lucas made to Star Wars. I like the original, the canon. But as I mentioned, for so long, this idea of having a canon, a definitive version of a narrative, has just been my mode. And having thought deeper about oral narrative it has really shifted my perspective on the value of having an ever-changing experience with narrative. Why can't there be room in the world for both? That's sort of a question I've been asking myself.